Hi, good afternoon, everyone. A real pleasure to be here and also really to learn a lot about the research that is really outside of my field of expertise, but I find so much cohesion and kind of similarities across sectors. So I think some of what you've said will be also mirrored in my presentation here. SEQUAL stands for Social-Ecological Relations and Gender Equality. We are looking at the SDG between gender and climate change. And the aim of the project is to look at gender differences, but gender differences in terms of social relations and therefore power relations in how men and women have participated and also have leadership over natural resource and climate change related policies and governance practices on the ground. So we're trying to look at how power between genders actually play out both in the policy arena and also in the governance practices. So we're looking at how gender is framed and addressed within climate change and resource policies at different levels. Some of our partners are looking at EU level and the national level. Some of us are looking between global norms and national levels, and also between national and subnational levels. So we want to further our understanding the nuances of gender-power relations under conditions of changing social and ecological conditions of climate change. And we believe that by providing, critical analyses of these gaps and linkages, we can also kind of bring the spotlight to issues that are often not talked about in policymaking and also in everyday gendered practices. Okay, before I think I flipped my slides around, but let me introduce our team. We are a group from Stockholm Resilience Center in Stockholm University, the Nordland Research Institute in Northern Norway, University of Vik, University of Helsinki. And we are really, most of us come from social sciences, some from ecology, but most of us from social sciences from a very wide range. So from policies and governance, economics, sustainability science, political economy, agroecology, and so on. And I think all of us have a certain level of gender expertise, whether it is through working women in development type projects, gender mainstreaming, but also we have a group of feminist activists and scholars within our group, and that's been really enriching also our studies. So this picture was taken in our kickoff meeting in Stockholm in June of 2019, and unfortunately we have not been able to meet all together as a team since then. That's also a consequence of COVID and all of that, but also I think COVID is not only impacting how we meet, but it also changes lives drastically. And so many of us have changed institutions, but we all still continue to work together on this project through Zooms, Zoom workshops, Zoom trainings, and so on. And we are still trying to make a last meeting even after our project sometime this summer. So the issue of climate change and gender is very difficult in terms of when we were conceptualizing what we are going to study, because climate change is a cross-cutting topic, it's a cross-sectoral topic. And if you look at a climate change policy, it's not climate change policy there it is, it's climate change policy as it will be implemented in forestry, energy, infrastructure, economic growth, whatever the case may be. So it is cross-cutting. And gender mainstreaming or gender equality is equally a cross-cutting strategy. And even though you might have some policies that say you have to include gender principles or gender equality, how each sector implements those gender policies is drastically different. So we have this challenge then of what is the intersection of analyses we're going to do. And so we decided to pick the sector that is considered critical within the country's climate policy. So for example, in Sweden, it is in forest sector is one of the biggest sectors that has been identified in the climate policy. And so we look at forest and rural development and gender equality or gender equity within that. In Spain, it's climate change and food security policies. In Norway, it's climate change and energy policies, and they look at it both at the EU level and also at the national level. And then we decided that we can't only focus on the global north because climate change is such a huge issue. And so we wanted to also understand how global norms of European gender equality actually translate on the ground. And so we looked at Burkina Faso and Vietnam and looked at how international development aid, whether it's through climate or rural development, also bring gender equality policies and how that is translated and retranslated from the global north to south. So the policies are slightly different, but we all apply a same method. So we used a post-structural discourse analysis to look at how the policies problematize gender equality within these sectors. We also then have case studies in Spain because it's about food security. We looked at women shepherds in the pastoral commons of the Pyrenees. In Norway, because it is about energy and land and wind. So we looked at how that affected Sami reindeer herding communities in the subarctic region. And in Burkina Faso and Vietnam, we looked at community forestry. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little bit of findings from each of the types of analysis we did and give them a little bit of a general finding and some examples from each country. So I mentioned that we use a post-structural critical policy analysis, and it's called the WPR, which is the What's the Problem Represented to Be framework. So by using this framework, you're looking at policy to see how policy is problematizing a certain issue. And you can see how it's problematizing a certain issue by what solutions they are proposing. So if you choose to say that, to have more gender equality, we need to provide more capacity to women. Essentially, the problem that policy is saying is that women are have inadequate training or skills. So it is an approach advanced by Carol Barchi from Australia, and it's kind of really gained a lot of traction in how we examine policy and policy processes. So what we find across all the countries is the policies highlight a very positivist and technocratic focus. So the challenges, the solutions for climate change tend to be a technical fix, particularly also with gender. And so what we argue is that that kind of really ignores the contestations and the social political issues around gender. And it also makes invisible this gendered and intersectional power relations. So for example, in Sweden, in the forest sector, so while Sweden has a very advanced national gender policy, how the forest sector, which is a key sector that is aimed, that is targeted by the climate change policy to support climate mitigation and adaptation. The forestry sector looks at gender equality as a problem of numbers. So if we only, gender equality is an issue of having, the same numbers of men and women. But it is about putting women within a field that is very masculine. So it is about putting women into production, into learning how to use equipment. So the training, the capacity building they're saying is to how to enable women to work in the forestry sector. But it is not considering how women's perspectives and knowledge might change the sector towards a more sustainable, resilient sector, but it is, a very traditional production sector. So it is trying to kind of retrofit just numbers of women into a sector that is not really to change. In Spain, climate change is seen very much from an issue of carbon emissions, and the focus is on getting economic investments to sequester carbon and to move towards a low carbon economy. And there they see gender or women as a possibility, as a labor force that might be incorporated to transfer to a low carbon economy. So women are also seen as just part of a numbers kind of issue, and not about bringing different knowledge in how sectors can be low carbon and sustainable and resilient. So it's a very kind of a neoliberal fix in Spain. In Norway, gender and climate policies are rarely linked. So our colleagues in Norway find that the opportunities for gender mainstreaming is really tremendous. But where it is discussed, it's often very stereotypical, where women and climate change is a problem of culture in the global south. It's women who are the victims, they're very vulnerable. But women in the north is very based on economic structure. So women in the north have a lower carbon footprint. So it's really kind of reinforcing the stereotypes of north, south, and men and women again. So it's not really bringing nuances of what that means. And in Burkina Faso, we looked at a lot of international development aid, so ODA, Overseas Development Aid strategies on climate and on national development policies. And the Global North development aid agencies see gender equality as a human right. But the Burkina Faso policies see gender equality as a way to get to access your human rights. So in a sense, it's a bit of a blame. They blame gender inequality on local culture. Local culture is seen as static, where else the formal structures, education, health, access to health is seen as the way of promoting gender equality. So it's kind of this blame, and it's women who are not able to capitalize on the benefits of gender equality. So we find this kind of problematizations really kind of restricts what is possible. And so one thing about the WPR approach is that policies can be very powerful in how they problematize an issue and therefore the solutions they promote, but they are also very influential in what they choose to silence. So we're trying to do now comparative analyses across all the 4 countries, and what we find is silences by history, and this is something that was discussed in the earlier panel, is that gender inequality is not an issue of today, it's and gender roles have also changed over time in different cultures. So Swedish women were part of the forestry sector very much so just 40, 50, 60 years ago before industrial forestry became a norm, for example. There is also the silence by geography, different global north-south, but also national to local governments. There's a lot of discussion in amongst our group, also amongst in this. And then the last 2 things I want to mention is silence by science and by measurement. So what is being measured? Who is measuring gender equality? Is it just about numbers? Is it about, are we measuring women in Swedish forestry based on absolute numbers, or are we measuring it based on positions of power, for example? So what is being measured? And, we talked about science supporting policy making, but I think policy making also chooses the kind of science you want to accept. So in many cases, we also find that science is also silencing some of these gender inequalities. Okay, and then at the second level, from the policy review, we also have field case studies. In Spain, we looked at, we were working with women pastoralists in forest commons, and our colleagues used feminist life history approach, where you not only try to understand the different roles of women today, but also to understand them across past generations. So it's an intergenerational role. And what we find is that the diversity of women pastoralist roles and their contributions to local economy really disrupts the common stereotypes that is that is out in the scholarship today. And what we find is also that as these areas of Spain is moving towards industrial farming and industrial livestock, it leads to a depopulation of rural spaces and a masculinization of rural spaces. And with that, we find a loss of diversity in practices and diversity in how farming systems are operating. In Norway, we looked at very much on Sami indigenous knowledge in reindeer herding. The global norms of how large carnivore management and participation is being practiced here. So there are local governance systems that involve many groups. However, what our colleagues find is that a lot of these spaces have the task, but not the authority. So the reporting and accountability is still upward rather than downward to local people. So, still static forms of climate adaptive planning is used when reindeer herding is very much seasonal and wide-ranging, and that system is also changing under climate change, but these things, this knowledge is not taken in. And not only is indigenous knowledge not taken in, gender roles are barely considered in these governance systems. And finally, in Burkina Faso and Vietnam, we looked at community forestry. Again, global norms of participation, local governance is built into these local community groups, but oftentimes, what we've also found is very much fixated on what we call the communal fix. So it is the local indigenous community that is perfectly adapted to manage this. So again, it is kind of making static something that is a very dynamic system. And here we do a very highly intersectional study, and what we find is ethnicities, age, whether you are a migrant and whether you are a migrant from last generation or 3 generations ago, men, women, and to a certain level occupations. And these kind of have many different levels of contestations. And having a policy that focuses on one local is not particularly helpful and actually reinforces a lot of these contestations. Okay, instead I flipped around a little bit the socioeconomic impacts to think about what we have learned for more sustainable and gender equal impacts, you could say. What we found also, like working with brokers are incredibly important. Bringing information to brokers, and these can be extension agents, as in Spain, local government actors, development workers, civil society and grassroots groups, activist groups, have been really enriching and useful. And women networks are really important, both in terms of creating care networks, safety net networks, but also they can support bringing out voice about what are alternative models of sustainability beyond what is only seen in a policy, and bringing forth different types of leadership. And we find that industrial agriculture, industrial forestry have led to loss of local knowledge systems, and we feel like this has real implications for adaptive governance and resilience. And particularly with changing social-ecological systems with very large-scale fixed practices that does not help. And also, lastly, we find that integration of global norms like decentralization, participation, gender equality are really important, but they are kind of hollow if they are just a checkbox to say, okay, we focus on indigenous peoples and women, but you don't tackle power imbalances and authority. So that's things. And in terms of future research, so I think this was just mentioned in the last discussion panel, but gender inequalities are really structurally, in our view, about unequal power relations. So it is about social constructs, but in how gender inequalities is related in how power is unequal. We also argue that gender research must focus on men, because the overly focus on women has meant to mean that women are expected to also fix the problem. So it's not only fixing ourselves, but it's fixing the problem. And we feel like to include men in all these studies means that we have to fix the structure or the system. We also argue all research should take intersectional approach. This has been talked about many times, but working in the rural space, intersectionality is so critically important, and learning to get at different types of data and participatory research has also shown us how to do this better. And finally, we want to make a call for investments in participatory feminist research. This has been something that we have learned from our team members, and this is really enriching because, you know, gender issues, as we've mentioned, is not, I think it was just Jose who said that it was not a today problem, but it has its roots in history, and it has its roots in the future. And so we kind of need this long-term reciprocal research and building relationships to understand gender issues in both the global north and south. So just some outputs. We have a special issue coming out. One of the papers are published. A couple more is coming together. We have some publications published, a bunch of papers in review, and a bunch we hope to be submitted before the end of the month. We've also done some conferences, both on methods. So we participated in the WPR conference in Stockholm University, where this WPR approach is really applied to all kinds of sectors, and I find it a very productive way of examining policy. And also we've done some research to policy, science to policy conferences and so on. So yes, that's the project and the website for more information, and happy to talk more. Thank you.